this July it will be 12 years. It wasn't really my first project. My first project was doing some other work in Interp, but this is where I landed literally 11 years ago of this month in February 2020. I started doing research for a wayside exhibit project that was going in and being planned for Schoodic Peninsula. And my job was sort of to think about the human history there and what are the things that we can talk about for visitors that we find important. And so we started off there at Fraser Point. And as we sort of all know now, Thomas Fraser was the first documented free African-American resident of Fraser Point and potentially of Hancock County. And Fraser Point was, purportedly or probably, or maybe not, we'll see what I have to tell you, named for the earliest recorded landowner, who was actually a London merchant banker named Thomas Fraser. So that's where we're going to start today. So Abe, can you go to the first slide? Thanks. So for folks that know Acadia or don't know Acadia, I thought it would be helpful to sort of pinpoint what exactly we're talking about. So the slide on the left has a little pin drop right at Fraser Point, that is today. And the slide on the right kind of shows where that is vis-a-vis Mount Desert Island, the main part of Acadia National Park, versus the Schoodic district of Acadia. And so you can see that wonderful bit of water in between there. That's Frenchman Bay, which actually is 7 miles across, but I think I know that times before ours, that 7 miles wasn't as long as we think it is today. So there was a lot of history that's happened in between and on that little bit of bay. So, and you're going to hear about some of it today. So that's what we're talking about in location, and this is some of the things we know. So Abe, can you go to the next slide? So to talk about Fraser Point and to put it back to where I started with this 12 years ago, I have to mention that obviously the work that I've been able to do over the past 12 years really started with the archaeology that was done by the National Park Service, primarily Peter Morrison and Pam Crane, who are two fantastic archaeologists who worked under the direction of Rebecca Colwill, who is our Chief of Resource Management, as you know now, but was then at the Abbey Museum. And they were the excavators, the archaeologists that worked on doing the excavation in 1998 and 1999 at the spot that uncovered Fraser's homestead. That's helped us to start off figuring out what did Fraser's family life look like. But of course, I would be remiss, and we know this, but I will continue to say it as many of us do at Acadia, that although I'm talking about a slice of history of Thomas Fraser and his family on Fraser Point, long before it was Fraser Point, long before this was Acadia or this was Maine, this has and continues to be the central homelands of the Wabanaki people since time immemorial. So it's important for us to remember that and to note that and to continue to say that. So I'm talking about a little slice of human occupation on that site where it is named Fraser Homestead. But of course, that history goes back millennium, but with many, many people before then, and continues to have those people on the landscape today. Having said that, when Pam and Peter did the excavation, they weren't surprised to note that there were also ancestral Wabanaki occupations that were uncovered in that area as well. It was a little slice of land that, like I said, has thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history on it. And so some of the archaeological artifacts that helped tell the story of Thomas Fraser, I have some of them pictured here. Pieces of ceramics from the time period, like pearlware and redware, that were really indicative of a late 1700s, early 1800s, sort of like the fashionable, what people were putting their food in and storing things in back then. There's a beautiful little rat tail spoon from the site as well, again, like confirming the time period that people were living there. And then, of course, there was a couple of really interesting finds, like the 1802 penny that you can see there. If you look really carefully, you can see 1802 on the bottom of it. Archaeologists are always really excited when they can find something like that, an artifact that would be considered a diagnostic artifact, so something that we know exactly it has 1802 on it. It was made in 1802. It was left there probably around that time period. And so the pieces of the puzzle to sort of secure that this was a homestead for a certain amount of time that was Fraser's homestead definitely those artifacts supported that and helped to lay the base and the groundwork for the story that we know about Thomas Fraser and his family. Some of the other important archaeology and the data that was taken there and learned there was that there were pigs and sheep and chicken and white-tailed deer bones. So there was animal husbandry that they were practicing to live. They were hunting and trapping and fishing. Also, interestingly, there were some bones from a now extinct sea mink, which were discovered actually in the Fraser family cellar. And at that point, at least, that was the first historic period site in Maine that was able to, to show or to boast sea mink, the sea mink, bones, which was kind of cool. It was typically found in earlier sites, but to be able to find that in what archaeologists call historic sites, so 1600 to the present, was kind of a cool and interesting thing. So, what do these artifacts, tell us, and what does the science of archaeology tell us about what these people were doing on the landscape then? As I said, it tells us they were fishing, they were farming, they were trapping, they were hunting, and rumor has it, or the rumor mill, or whatever you want to call it, it's been passed down that Thomas Fraser operated a saltworks, so or a mill, and both of those ideas were sort of archaeologists looked for evidence of a salt works and a mill in that site, and they weren't conclusive. From what I've read, it didn't look like it was an exhaustive search, but there weren't any remnants or anything that was leading the archaeologist Pam and Peter to think one way or the other that they could prove that. It's definitely something that has been part of the history, and if you have you've studied this and you've read that over and over again, so you've heard that story too. Some of the things that we do know about Thomas Fraser are kind of funny. I've said this before. It's like he and his family were sort of like really true Mainers, right? They had lots and lots of jobs. They did whatever they could to sort of survive, whether it was fishing or farming or animal husbandry or salt work. So again, an interesting part of history there, and something that we all know today, what that feels like. So yeah. So those are the sort of the physical artifacts that we find in the science behind the archaeology that helped us tell a little story. And Abe, if you want to move to the next slide. We also had, so Peter and Pam laid such fantastic groundwork for the archaeology and the stories that they told about what people were doing there based on the artifacts they left behind. They also laid some breadcrumbs out for some archival work that they did, and I used those breadcrumbs, and I'm still using those breadcrumbs, and have found some new breadcrumbs along the way. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the things that I found about Thomas Fraser that are more primary source documents and what those tell us about what we can know and what we can't know. So this slide you see here, it marks Thomas Fraser and his wife Mary on the landscape in 1776. So this is a deed from the Hancock County Registry of Deeds that was signed. Whoop. Abe, you're in the right place, Abe. Uh-oh. All right, I'll just keep talking. Even Abe, I'll wait for Abe to get the slide back there. Here we go. So you can see there at the bottom, hopefully, you can see that it says Thomas Fraser, it says with his mark, and Mary Fraser, which was his wife, signed. And this deed is transferring property from Thomas Fraser and Mary Fraser's names into the names of Moses Butler. And he was an early settler to the Schoodic Peninsula and to Sullivan area. And this piece of property that's being transferred over in 1776 from the Frasers to Moses Butler, I've sort of tried to show you where it is, where it is on the map today. And you can see there on the little top of my little path there. It's right up near, if you're not familiar, Egypt Bay, Sullivan area. And, it was about 100 acres. And that is him physically on the landscape. It's a year after, well, 1776, kind of an important year. We're going to probably hear about it a lot coming up soon. So, by seeing that his mark is on that, we have to wonder, it looks as though he was illiterate. His wife Mary is on the deed, which is, I think for me, it's a cool thing to see a woman's name on a deed in the middle of colonial Maine at this time with her husband who's made his mark. And it's just cool to see something. This is probably the earliest that we have him physically proven as a primary source document there in the vicinity of Goldsboro, even it's not in the town. And then the next slide, Abe. Another place that we see him is, this is 20 years later, it's 1795. This is a land survey that was done by A. Green Crabtree, who is a very well-known, the Crabtrees are very well known around that area. They arrived around 1764 with a lot of the other settlers. And A. Green Crabtree did 2 surveys of this area, one in June of 1779 and one in December. And this is the December one. And if you, I've sort of pointed it out in red there, the arrow is pointing to a place name on the map in 1795, which is the place where Thomas Fraser, a piece of land that Thomas Fraser sold to Moses Butler. 20 years later, it's still named Fraser's Landing right there. So Thomas Fraser's moved on, he sold his land. It's still called Fraser's Landing and a place name. Directly across from that says M. Butler. That is one of the other parcels that Moses Butler owned. And then I put a special map in there, off to the side, a Google map that tells you exactly where that is today. Where's the location of the parcel marked Fraser's Landing? That's no longer a place name there. There is a little road, which I'm going to go down at some point, as long as that's not private property, that's called Landing Road, but the word Fraser's gone, erased from that. But the place name of Butler Point, M. Butler, is still located there. I mean, even Google says it. So Butler's name has stayed on the landscape in that area, and the Fraser name is gone, but the word Landing Road is still there. So another place that we've seen Thomas Fraser on the landscape, even though this wasn't a property map, it was still called as a place name, his name. And the next slide, Abe. So the most exciting, and this is kind of breaking news. I mean, I called Becky, of course, and told her like immediately, and my kids know because we talked about it at the dinner table. But there was a breadcrumb left by Peter and Pam about potentially Fraser being in the Revolutionary War. So I spent a lot of time trying to track down the rosters and the roles, and I finally found him listed as Thomas Fraser in Frenchman's Bay, a private Captain Henry Dyer's company of rangers, enlisted in 1780 and discharged a couple of months later, and he was there on Frenchman's Bay. And so that was the top left little snip that you see there that put that pretty much in stone. So I felt really, really good about that. And that's where I started with the finding Private Frazier, because I figure once you are in a federal document, if we're all doing our jobs right, we can find you again and again and again if we're doing right by our federal records. So I figured that was great. So I had to put that Thomas Fraser, to bed for many, many years, and I keep looping back into him over the past 12 years. And a couple of years ago, I went to the volume. This is all retranscribed information from original rolls, and volume 7, I think, out of 17 rolls of Massachusetts, of course, Revolutionary War soldiers, because Maine was part of Massachusetts, so that's where the roll is. And I'm flipping through, and I'm always used to, with Thomas Fraser, his name is spelled differently so many ways. So anytime I'm doing a search, I have to do, it's like Z-E-R, Z-I-E-R, S-E-R, S-I-E-R. I mean, it's 5 different spellings to search through things. And so I'm used to scanning and scanning and scanning visually for those combinations. It's almost like my brain is trained for that combination. So somehow, when I was flipping through volume 6 of, the Fs of all the people in Massachusetts and Maine that went to the war, I'd missed this first little snippet. And I found it a couple of years ago, and I think I went under the kitchen table because I was like so in shock that I missed this. And if you can see there, it says Fraser Thomas, so F-R-A-S-H-A-R. And this is in the same book. So this is just like an alphabetized list of every entry that's ever been found about any human being that was in the Revolutionary War at this time. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, okay, this is fantastic, but I can guess that this is maybe a misspelling or a transcription error, but I want to believe, but I needed the proof for it. And so I've kept that in the side of my head, Fraser. And then literally the other night, I give a similar talk for the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and I had been looking for some, it was just after that, I'd been looking to do a little more research on Henry Dyer, who was listed in the first company, or so I thought was the first company. And I did a word search on Henry Dyer, and I found the listing that I have on the right there, which undeniably connects Henry Dyer as and I can't even read it myself because it's so small, that's from memory, as the second lieutenant in Captain Eliezer Crabtree's company in 1775, which is Thomas Fraser's company in 1775. Henry Dyer's enlisting dates and his de-enlisting dates are the exact same as both Thomas Fraser and Fraser's dates. And so Henry Dyer was sort of the missing link for me. He's was a resident of Sullivan, so he was Fraser's neighbor up in Egypt Bay, and then he was commissioned a week and a half or 2 weeks before Thomas Fraser, who was Fraser's first entry into the war. And so these were soldiers and living together and fighting together and hunting together. And it was a really exciting discovery. So I feel as though I can be a good historian and really say, yes, I know this is true. And now that I found him in 2 places, I'm going to add Fraser to my spelling that I've got to add now when I'm searching for folks. But it was a really exciting part to know that Thomas Fraser was enlisted, a free African-American man, was listed and enrolled in the Revolutionary War in 2 times, in 1775 and in 1780, and right here on the coast of Maine. So very excited about that. And Abe, the next slide. So Thomas Fraser and his family show up in a couple other places in terms of primary source documents. One is town tax records, the town of Goldsboro. He paid his taxes. He was, based on what he was paying, he wasn't poor. He was a middle income. He seemingly paid them on time and in full. And so we know that he was a part of that, and he paid them through, I think it was 1810 was the last one I've seen. So this was a longevity that was happening, of longevity of payments and being in that space. But the more sort of exciting piece, and the one that we all have heard about a number of times, is that Thomas Fraser and his family were recorded in the very first US population census in 1790. And I have a scan of the original here. And he was recorded in the 1790 census, which is first, in the 1800, the 1810, and it wasn't on the 1820. He's sort of disappeared. He and his family have disappeared physically in terms of the artifacts from the Fraser homestead, disappear between 1810 and 1820. Primary source documents disappear between 1810 and 1820. So this is kind of the disappearing decade for him. But one of the things that is so striking about this, and you can physically see it here, is that Thomas Fraser and his family, they were recorded literally in the margin. He's literally scrawled in the margin. And in the margin, you probably can't see, but it says, I quote, Thomas Fraser, a mulatto, his wife, and 7 children. And so, when we're talking about people, and we're talking about marginalized people and marginalized histories, I don't think you could come up with a better first-hand example of marginalization. Now, do we know, do we wish we know exactly how this came to be? We could, make up stories all day long. Was it who came to the door when the census taker came there? Who did he see? Did he make it to the door? Was this an afterthought? I mean, what is it? But he's literally in the margin. And to see something like that is just so striking. It just reminds us so much about how we write down history and the ways in which we do it, and how that matters or doesn't matter. I should say too that just like the Revolutionary War rolls, these primary source documents of the census were actually like done in compilation later. So they were transcribed and transformed many times over. And folks who are used to looking at primary source documents, know this, but information changes along the way, categories change along the way. So one of the things I'm going to do is I want to really take a really hard look at, I have some of the transcriptions of the 100 in 1810 census, but I don't have very good copies, full copies of the originals. I think it's important for me to look at the originals, because when I looked at the 1790 transcription, Thomas Fraser and his family are moved to a brand new, completely different category from where they are here, because it's a spreadsheet. They are moved all over. There is a 9. You can see the columns here. That's like based on age and gender. So and so, how many white males under the age of so and so are in one column. How many white females under the age of so and so are in another column. But the categories change and are shifted, and all 9 of the Fraser family are shifted into one category at the end of. And we read this: are all free persons, not slaves, not white males, and not females. That's what that category means. So all of them are down there. So the transcription matters and the originals matter. And I want to make sure I get my hands on the originals. Next slide, Gabe. Okay, so you've noticed I probably haven't talked much about Lane, Son, and Fraser, and that's sort of been on purpose, because I think that so much of the story that I heard when I first started looking at it, and everybody was pointing to like Lane, Son, and Fraser. They were the merchant bankers, and Thomas Fraser, London Fraser was the person that we should be starting with. And I sort of went down some pretty far rabbit holes with them because they're really well documented. And there's actually, I mentioned this before, there's actually like a group of gentlemen that I am friendly with now in Britain, and who are like expats from Australia and so forth, or have a history with Australia, and they study merchant bank networks in London around this time. So there's a group of people that are studying everything, and thank goodness for the internet, because I found them, and we've gone back and forth with what we think is happening with Thomas Fraser London and Thomas Fraser settler a lot. And they are very passionate, and I really appreciate their constantly entertaining my crazy stories and crazy ideas. But you can see here 2 things. One is on your left is the actual plan from the Hancock County Registry of Deeds, the plan of what in 1795, when the town of plantation of Gouldsboro, town of Gouldsboro, was being sold over to William Shaw from Lane and Fraser. And that's sort of the 4 little pieces there. On the right, this is from a more recent book, and I don't know the original. I think this may have been hand-drawn based on this plan. I can't find anything else. It sort of makes it a little more clear. So you can see how in this is dated at 1763, as if it were a plan from 1763, but I don't think it's not. It is I believe, just a clear representation of the actual deed you see on the left there. But you can see that Lane and Son, because in 1763, they were still Lane and Son, sort of owned that half of Gouldsboro. And if you've already seen the other slides where Thomas Fraser's homestead is, like it's on the other side where Shaw is. So it leads me to believe again that, by sometime, maybe the whole story isn't really about Thomas Fraser London. There could be some other things going on there. So a quick recount of what was going on in the land there that early. In 1763, remember, we see Thomas Fraser on the landscape. In 77, selling to Moses Butler. In 63, that Gouldsboro area that you see here was surveyed by Robert Gould, supposedly for Lane and Son, because there was no Fraser yet. And then in 64, Gould got a grant. Gould and Shaw and Nathan Jones got a grant. So they were granted that whole area. And they immediately, in 64, started getting settlers to come up to improve the land, to do stuff. And this was a revolution, and there were resources in Maine to be had. And so any land that was unimproved wasn't going to be providing anybody with any money. So it's also coincidentally the same time that we see a lot of the other settlers coming. A. Green Crabtree, Moses Butler, some of the folks I've already talked about. So 1764, there's a lot of folks coming up this way to get on this landscape, to improve it or to work or to log it, whatever. It wasn't until 1766 that Thomas Fraser London joined the firm of Lane, Son, and Fraser. So that is kind of an interesting piece. It wasn't always Lane, Son, and Fraser. He came on a little bit later, was in the firm for 30 years or so. By the time this deed here on the left that you see, but this reflects the selling of that property of Lane, Son, and Fraser to William Shaw. And the reason that's sort of important is because Lane, Son, and Fraser fails as a bank in 1793. They were big financiers of the American Revolution, and many other merchant businesses are related to the Revolution, and they fail And so they sell their land right then. So this is that document, 1795, that shows that sale over. And the chain of deeds isn't that exciting after that, because it doesn't relate to Thomas Fraser. So, you know, this is sort of where there's a lot of things I don't know, and I'll wait to see what you ask me, because I have so many things I don't know. I don't want to sit here and tell you all the things I don't know. So wait to see if you have some questions about things I don't know and why I don't know them. But I do think it's like, you know, it's really important. Like these are really hard stories to tell. And, you know, they're hard stories to tell because primary source documents have been transcribed and translated in ways over the years that have really left important information out. You know, depending on who's transcribing them, what metadata they are leaving out or they're thinking isn't important, really adds to the erasure of people and groups, whether that group is based on class or racial, ethnic background or gender. And I think as we are constantly being pushed to digitize things, which is how we have to do it, right? I mean, before this pandemic, we still have to do that to preserve it and to provide access. But it's really important when we're doing that, we remember that we have an obligation to capture all the details, whether or not we think they're important or not, whether or not they come through our lens in the way that reflects us. And I think that's why this is a hard story to tell, because some of the things we do as historians, or some of the things we do to primary source documents, contributes to the erasure of people. And I'll give you a quick example. When I was going to look for the Hancock County deeds of registries, I wanted to get a better copy of the deed that I had, because it was kind of old. So I knew I had the book and page because I had a terrible hard copy of it from years ago. And the Hancock County has a new fantastic system of organizing online their stuff. Everything's digitized. So I'm like going in at Fraser, nothing comes up. Moses Butler, nothing comes up. 17, you know, all this, nothing comes up. Then I finally just went deed, nothing comes up. I'm like, how can this deed on this book and this page not be coming up as a deed? The metadata wasn't there for his name, it wasn't for Moses Butler. Like, this is crazy. Like, luckily I knew it was there because I had a copy. So I phoned the Hancock County deeds, and I spoke with the woman there, and I told her my issue. I wasn't really searching it correctly on the book and deed. If I had done that correctly, I would have found it. But I told her, these people, you know, I have this deed and it has all these names in it, and they're not coming up. It's not even coming up as a deed. She found it. The person that transcribed and put the metadata in for that deed and many other early deeds like that did not include name, did not include date, did not even include it, didn't even know it was a deed. And I'm guessing that, you know, they either couldn't read the cursive or didn't want to. I mean, you could probably read it on the slide, and the slide's not even that great. They just didn't go through the trouble to read the name of the person that was selling it, the name of the person that was buying it, that it was a deed. And so that metadata wasn't part of that anymore. And so let's make up a story that I never did anything about Thomas Fraser, and 10 years down the road, someone wants to go find the deed. If they search by Fraser, they won't find it. If they search by deed, they won't find it. It is literally an unindexed and unidentified piece of history that has contributed to the erasure of this story and these people. So that's why these stories are hard to tell. The other reason these stories are hard to tell, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, is sometimes, you know, by all accounts, you know, this is a story about a marginalized person and their family. And by definition, stories like that are pushed to the side. That's what a marginalized story is. It's what a marginalized person is. It's pushed to the side. And we, you know, can read on a deed, you know, or read on a census that the word mulatto, and we know that it means other, but we may have to think a little bit about what that might mean. What did that term mean at the time? Why was that term written there? Why was he moved to another category in another year, in another 10 years? You know, these are hard stories to tell, and a lot of times we only want to tell the easy ones. So I hope that we can continue in Acadia and elsewhere, you know, to tell stories that really reflect the true depth and breadth of the human experience on the landscape. And I think that, you know, we really need to kind of push ourselves to tell harder stories, ones that are harder to like figure out and research and know, and ones that are harder in that maybe they make us feel uncomfortable, or maybe they question, what we have always thought to be true or what we want to be true. So that is what I know about Thomas Fraser at this point. And like I said, I don't, there's lots of stuff I don't know. So maybe we can check the chat and see what else people want to know. I could talk for a long time, but I don't have that much time.
Great, thank you very much, Marie. That was awesome. That was really great. So we don't have very many questions. So folks should start definitely adding questions to the chat. It looks like Pauline. Pauline, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
And you can take the slide off if you want, Abe. Doesn't matter.
Marie, I think you mentioned that the family disappeared from the records around 1810 to 1820. Did they ever reappear?
So, not that I can find. So that's another one of those things. I can't find a record of him dying or Mary dying. I can't find a record of their marriage. They don't seem to be in any area censuses. They don't, nothing in the area. And I've also gone to, I'm on ancestry.com as well to figure that out. And doesn't search, doesn't come up anywhere, which is very frustrating. Very, very frustrating.
Are there other questions? You can feel free to, if you have a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it.
And I can just tell you all the things I don't know as well that other people have asked. We don't know, like the big thing is, this is what I'll just say, what I want to know. Like, I want to know how we got here. That's my biggest issue. I feel like if I knew how we got here, that would solve a lot. So the idea on the story, the oft repeated story, is that he was a land agent for Lane, Son and Fraser. So when they took over the property, took the land, I should say, they sent him there to improve it. And so that's been the story that's been told, but there's we don't know how we got here. We don't know if that's true. I mean, it's a convenient story. I think it sounds great, but we don't really know how a free African-American man in 1764 is being sent up, or is making, his way up to this very much uncharted territory. I mean, not physically uncharted, but just it's sort of on the frontier up here. Maybe he came under the direction of Thomas Fraser from London. Maybe he was a skilled seaman that was somehow made it to Boston and came up on a privateer, Green Crabtree, and is a very well-known and notorious privateer, privateer is sort of like a fancier version of pirate. So it was pretty common to be capturing ships along the way, claiming their goods, especially in the war. Usually he was doing it for someone, but I think Green Crabtree was on his own. And some of the times you have to make up stories to figure out what to look for next, like what are the documentation I want to look for next. And so if we make up the story that he was sent here by Thomas Fraser in London, then it would still be interesting to know how he got here from Boston. If we go with the story that he was somehow a freed enslaved person, then that triggers another set of questions. And I mentioned this in my other talk, and I think if you haven't checked this out, it's a very amazing resource. If you haven't looked at slavevoyages.com, which is a digital memorial and a database that traces the dispersal of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic world, you can see in animation style, even in a database style, the voyages, the voyages that enslaved people went on in terms of where ships left, where they went along the way to enslave people, and where they disembarked. And so I've been working with 1764 as sort of like a magical number that I've picked out, because there's so much activity in Goldsboro at that point in terms of people more people coming as settlers to that area. Of course, there were people there for thousands and thousands of years, but the Revolutionary War folks coming up that way and white settlers coming up that way, it's a big time. And I've found some interesting connections between a ship that left London, enslaved people along the way, and disembarked in Boston in 1764. So using databases like that, you know, the longer this takes, I think the more good resources there are out there to track marginalized people and to help to give life to marginalized stories. So
that was great. So David Elwood, it looks like, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks very much. This is really fascinating. I'm kind of intrigued by two different related things, maybe. The two different Thomas Frasers, and whether there's confusion between them or what you know about those different folks. The financier and and obviously the person who lived on Schoodic at Fraser Point. But also, you started with some deeds. It seemed like land was transferred from Thomas Fraser to other folks. That sounds to me like someone who's more than marginalized. They actually are property owners. They have place and so forth. And it sort of, is it in that era, do things just kind of appear? You don't see the original ownings? Or, I mean, how, that part was confusing to me, and maybe I misunderstood, but and maybe that's the other Thomas Fraser, but that was an unusual feature of someone who is then marginalized in the census and hardly exists after that.
Yeah, so let me clarify. So in 1776, with that piece of land that was deeded and sold for 30 pounds or something like that to Moses Butler, that's the first time we see Thomas Fraser, settler Thomas Fraser, on the landscape. I can't find any deeds before then, like Hancock County Registry of Deeds doesn't have anything recorded before then for anything, even unrecorded. Like last night, I just went through dates and like looked through everything as early as I possibly could. Nothing's there. That may just mean that it doesn't exist. It may mean that it was in a land grant that isn't under the auspice of Hancock County. You know, it's something in Massachusetts, a Commonwealth. Massachusetts Historical Society. So that's another, like, I typically will try to go until I hit a wall with my line of research. And when I hit a wall, like I can't find anything back before this transaction of the deed of the selling. I can't find the purchasing or the donation or the granting or whatever it was before then, because it may not be in that same line of research or the same repository, clearly. So that's one thing. The second thing is your question about the two Thomas Frasers. So the sort of like the going story is that they were related somehow, like not related as, you know, related physically, but there is a relationship between the Thomas Frasers. You know, they had to have something so they knew each other. Like he was either sent here as a land agent when I call him London Fraser, you know, received the land or purchased the land in the land grant from Gould, and somehow he was sent here. For me, it's really hard to make sense of that, because like, what is the documentation that would connect Thomas Fraser settler with Thomas Fraser, the London banker? Okay, so they financed ships. So is there a ship that they financed that I can look at, and I can look at the register and see that there was a person on it that was non-white, or was a free African-American, or was Thomas Fraser, or was something, you know? So it's the stories that we're making up. It's hard to, sometimes you can't find the evidence. Like I thought I had found a wonderful registry, Lloyd's Shipping Registry, that went back as far as 1764. Well, of course, like when I get to like it was like, oh, 1764 through 1770, it was like flooded and it's like gone, like that's gone. So that's never going to happen. So I can't even look at the Lloyd's, you know, registry of ships that would have documented ships coming from London at that time and their cargo and their passenger list. Like that's gone to me now. Maybe there's another way I can find that out. But the question is, yes, is there a relationship between Thomas Fraser settler and Thomas Fraser, the London banker? everyone kind of wants that to be true. And maybe that would be great if that were true. But so far, there's nothing connecting the two of them other than they have the same-ish name. And how I can know whether or not they are connected is the primary source part that becomes very frustrating. That's where I have to keep making up. If they were connected, then maybe they would show up in this way. Maybe it'd show up in a register. Maybe it'd show up on a, a document. Maybe it'd show up in a diary. Maybe it'd show up, and finding those things is the hard rule. And so whether or not someone is, so philosophically about your question about marginalization, so, because this person owned property, which was fantastic, right, in 1776 and sold it, does that mean that they aren't marginalized or do not have the ability to be marginalized in other ways in life by other institutions or systems that are set up? And I would say, no, that doesn't preclude them from being marginalized in other ways and in other systems, So the census, when it was put forth, and this is another one of my things, I have to read more about how they did the census. I've only read a little bit, especially the first census. But there were, I'm going to get the name wrong, but a captain, that's not the word, but I'm just thinking in terms of sports, who was in charge of the census in different areas, as they would be sent up and they would be doing the census. And so just like today, someone's knocking on your door, this was not a person that was from their community or from their neighborhood or from Sullivan. It was not like A. Green Crabtree or like Henry Dyer or these other folks that, knew the Frasers, and they were knocking on the door, and who knows who answered. Maybe it was Mary, maybe it was Thomas, maybe it was a child, and they're going to ask questions. Maybe they never made it to the door. Maybe that's why he's in the margin. Maybe they totally forgot about him because they didn't go down there. No one was there when they knocked on the homestead, and then they heard hearsay, oh yeah, there's this guy and he lives there with his family and he's black or he's mulatto or, he's other. We don't know what he is, but he's, whatever. And so, those are the things that we can't tell. But to your point as to whether or not someone can be marginalized in different ways throughout life, in different circumstances or different institutions, I think the answer is yes, they can.
Yeah, I certainly didn't mean to imply that he wasn't marginalized in lots of ways. I just wondered whether someone who held land who owned several property pieces of land at that time, is that a middle class person? Is that a person, almost anyone comes there to settle, land is there to be given. I'm just trying to understand what it means to be a landowner at that period.
Well, I can tell you that from the tax rolls, he wasn't poor because he paid his taxes. He paid seemingly on time, and he was not by the taxes that he paid, he was not a poor person. So he was a middle income person. Yes. I don't have enough information, haven't sort of delved into the backgrounds of what it means to be a landowner, but remember, people could come across land for lots of reasons. I mean, literally the whole, Gouldsboro was granted to one person. So, based on, in Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts said, we're going to grant you this. Maine was already being divided up. There were by little squares, the Gazetteer of 1763 or whatever. So Maine was being divided up, and people were entering in lotteries to grab land. So it wasn't really there's lots of ways people were getting land. And in addition, people who were landowners sometimes weren't on site. The addresses are Bristol, Massachusetts, but they needed to get people on the land to secure it or to do something with it or to start extracting resources from it and to people it and settle it. That's a story that we know very well as the founding of our country. That's what we've saw over and over again, and Maine was really no different.
Thanks. Pauline has another question. Pauline, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it?
I was just looking at the Marie, and I noticed that the landing road you pointed out is right near Crabtree Circle and Settlers Lane. Was that an early encampment, or is that just happenstance?
I didn't hear what you said. I didn't hear everything. You cut out.
The landing road that you mentioned, Fraser's Landing Road, the
Yes.
intersecting streets are called Settlers Lane and Crabtree Circle.
Yes,
That-
yes. Google Google, I don't know if, well, I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, that whole area was filled with the crab trees and the youngs. You see their names all over the landscape up there. You don't see Thomas Fraser's name up in that area, but he was one of the earliest recorded landowners. And I think it's very cool, you know, that we have a green crabtree survey 20 years later that shows that that was still called amongst the folks there. Enough of a, you know, it was good enough to be called that by a surveyor, and good enough, but it was strong enough, and it was still called Fraser's Landing. Now it's not. It's something to do with landing and settlers, and so that whole area was you know, in 1763 and 1764, there were people moving on there and, you know, settling it. I still think it's interesting that his is the one name that is not like up there anymore. I think it's cool and interesting and something to think about, because the Butlers are there and all other settlers are there, the Youngs and the Crabtrees. But he's not, his name isn't.
Rebecca, did you want to put a voice to your comment there?
No, I mean, it goes without saying. I want to keep Handy Lane. I want to keep Liscombe Pit. I want to keep these place names because they're important to you know, the laying of history onto place. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I mean, and it's just, I mean, we talk about the erasure of peoples and histories from primary source documents, but we also do it with the landscape. And I think it's important for us to, you know, remember that we have a lot of power in what we're doing when we're renaming things or naming things. And those are the names that stick, you know? So, and the histories that stick.
Yeah, yeah. Any last questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Kevin?
Hey, Marie, I just want to say great job, Marie. Really, really fantastic presentation. I came in a little bit late, but I think it's really important work that you're doing in helping to uncover these stories. And I'm hopeful that the park can really start to tell sort of broader human history of Acadia. And I think we've sort of told a piece of it, but just a very narrow piece of it for many years. And I think we have the opportunity to change it, but we need good research. We need good history and stories to be able to tell that story. So thank you for helping to uncover this.
Yep, thank you.
Marilyn Elwood, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just, if you know, how many free Black people were there in what we call Maine at that time? Do you have any sense?
I do. I don't know if I can find the, I have this like giant spreadsheet of all things in the world. I don't know if I can find that on this right here and now, but I did do one of the early, let me see if I can find his name. One of the early experts that I consulted in terms of, I believe I even emailed with him as well. It was so long ago. And I can't remember his name, maybe Stakeman, I can't remember. He's a professor either at Colby or Bowdoin. And I asked those questions, you know, what is the population like? I don't have those numbers in front of me, but what was the population of free or otherwise African-American people in Maine? And he was able to give me some really good, you know, information and really well done research that talks about that. Randall Stakeman, I think that's actually his name. And, you know, there's a lot more information in this for the southern parts of the states and for communities that had a larger population of African-American people. One of the most famous is Addisville, which is outside of Machias, which was a free Black community around the same time period as this. So I can't imagine that this wasn't the folks in Goldsboro, whether it was the Frasers or others, weren't connected to that as well, especially because Colonel John Allen, who was the commander at that time during the Revolutionary War for this part of Maine, was the commander in Machias as well for the Battle of Machias. So there were communities throughout Maine, but we know much more about those free African American communities when there was a larger population. So Addisville, I said, is a really important one, and then in lots of places in the southern part of the state. And I'm trying to look at my spreadsheet. You know, slavery was abolished in Maine. Of course, I can't find it now. So I don't, you know, I can't really answer that exact question, but it was a question I asked and it was an answer that I got. It just hasn't helped me find anything about Thomas Frazier, unfortunately, or connect him with other free African American communities during the Revolution just yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Rebecca mentioned to just like it is a part of a closing. I think we can wrap up, but she just mentioned your funding.
Oh, yes. I'll probably get the name of the fund source wrong, but so this is a great time to do this. Thanks for asking me, because Acadia received some funding under the Civil Rights Initiative to further explore Thomas Frazier and this story and its connection to colonial Maine, the American Revolution, and beyond. So I'm able to work on this, spend a lot more time on this. I won't be looping back every 10 years or so, be able to spend a lot more time on this funded project and hopefully get me either virtually or physically to some other repositories that I think might hold some keys to what we not want to know more about Thomas Frazier. So.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Marie. This was a terrific talk. It was really very, very informative.
Great.
Thanks a bunch. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it. And we will be posting the recording on the Schoodic Institute YouTube channel for those who are interested in viewing it later or pointing other people towards it later. Thanks a bunch. Take it easy.
Thanks.